Division of Rehmann. We welcome Senior Manager Consultant Katie Stewart and Senior HR Professional Kara Skotsky. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming down. You came down from the Grand Rapids area today?
Yes.
Awesome. How was the drive?
It was smooth. It was really good.
Nice. Well, HR really is a big issue in Michigan right now because there's so much confusion, and it's I don't think it's even been resolved yet. Has it? No. For those employers with regular employees, not tipped employees, not part-time employees, is there anything that they need to worry about or be aware of?
Yes. So effective February 21st, 2025, there is a new piece of legislation that was drafted, and it will go into effect for all Michigan employers with one or more employees. So the guidance states that for every hour an employee works, they are eligible to accrue 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours. And so that goes into effect February 21st. There's also the caveat that there's two different sizes of employers that is defined in this legislation. So small employers and large employers. The large employers are those with 10 or more employees, and the small employers are for 10 or fewer employees. And so large employers are required to provide 72 hours of paid sick leave each year to an eligible employee, and small employers are required to provide 40 hours of paid sick leave with additional 32 hours of unpaid sick leave per year.
Oh my.
And so it is uncapped as far as the rollover. If they accrue more than that, they can roll it over into the next year if they don't use it. But they are capped at that 72 hours.
So we, as an employer of about 15 people, were considered a large employer.
Yep.
And that's unusual because, you know, typically a small business is a couple hundred people or less.
Right.
So that, I think, for a typical small business, that can be alarming. And the other part is there's a lot of math involved. You've got to keep track. One more thing that a small business person has to keep track of. Is it onerous, do you think?
Yeah.
Yes.
It definitely will be. I think people are going to have to look at their policies to see if they're currently in compliance with those, but also their timekeeping systems and their payroll systems. Can they even track it as their policies will be written? So there's a lot that employers need to start thinking about now to really be preparing for it.
So you've brought a chart. We've got the Paid Medical Leave Act versus Earned Sick Time Act. The Paid Medical Leave Act, that's a federal act, isn't it?
No, so that is a Michigan Act.
It's a Michigan Act.
Yep, that was put into effect in March of 2019. And so under the PMLA, it's an employers for 50 or more employees only. And so if you have less than 50 employees, it wasn't something you needed to worry about. And under PMLA, they accrued 1 hour for every 35 hours worked. And it was maxed at 40 hours per year that they could use, and then 40 hours that they could roll over. So a little bit different than ESTA. ESTA expands upon those provisions of what employees are eligible for. And so again, it brings it to all employers that have one or more employee rather than the 50.
So in the old days, if someone was sick, they called in, they can't work, the employer doesn't want them there, and that was that. It might have happened, you know, every once in a while. Now with this being law, are employees going to be expected to just take time off as sick time even though they're not sick? Well, do you anticipate that that's going to be the common use of this law?
I think employees, hopefully by employers, like explaining what the policy is and having it clearly laid out to employers or to their employees of when they should use it or not, hopefully that will cause them to use it for the appropriate purposes. So a health condition, doctor's appointments, mental or physical health condition or illness or injury, or for a family member's. But hopefully they won't just be forcing people to use their sick time when they're not really sick. That's
Right.
definitely not what the law was intended for.
And this isn't like a paternity leave where, you know,
Right.
the new father wants time off. This doesn't cover that kind of thing, right?
Right, so it would just be an illness or injury, again, whether mental or physical, for the employee themselves or for their family members. So it could be for preventative care appointments, diagnosis, or any of the treatment appointments for that condition.
Can it include something like me time? I just need some me time to just decompress.
Could for the mental health piece,
Okay.
yeah. And, you know, documentation wise, we can't really require them to put a diagnosis of the condition on the documentation. So we can ask for it, but we may not know the exact reason why they're taking it off.
Is there a requirement that the employee have a note from their doctor if they're taking the time off?
So yes, employers can ask for a note for employees, but they have to be off for longer than 3 consecutive days. And then if there are any costs incurred by the employee for requesting that documentation from the doctor, that cost is now on the employer.
I would imagine there are employers that already have a sick policy that might even be more generous than this. How does that impact that employer?
Yeah, as long as it is more generous than what the Act states and it gives all the rights to employees that are laid out under the Act, they don't have to roll out another policy. They just have to make sure they're complying with the Act.
Can you bank your hours that you've accrued?
Yes, you can carry those over. The Act just limits the number of hours that you can utilize as an employee per year. And as Kara talked about, you can accrue at the 1 hour per 30 hours worked, but employers can also front load it or grant it to an employee, like at the beginning of the calendar year or their anniversary year, something like that. But if an employee works more than what they would have typically worked, so say works a lot of overtime, they may have accrued more time under the accrual process. So an employer is going to have to look back and potentially true up and make that employee whole. So it's complicated.
Yeah, can an employee say, oh, well, I'm so healthy, I take good care of myself, I never get sick. I want the same, I want the same benefit, but I want it in money. Can they substitute cash for time off?
Not as of right now that we know, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of unknowns still of how the guidance isn't perfectly clear yet.
Any other nuances with this new law that employers might not be aware of, Kara?
Yeah, so there is some documentation requirements that employers must maintain the hours worked as well as the sick time used for a minimum of 3 years. But then there's also the caveat that salary exempt employees also must start tracking their time. And so there's not clear guidance on how that is to happen or what employers need to do for that. So we do encourage employers to work with their employment attorneys to ensure that they're compliant.
When does this go into effect?
So February 21st, 2025.
Should employers just sit tight? Do you anticipate there will be any more changes or rulings regarding this before it is to be implemented?
Yeah, we are recommending that employers prepare as if it's going to take effect as it's written today, but hold off on implementing anything or communicating to employees any changes until the effective date, because we do anticipate some changes will occur between now and then.
Also up in the air, the minimum wage increase, and you know, a lot of employers, really, I think people generally feel, well, there's no one that's really making a minimum wage, so it doesn't really matter that much, right? Or does it?
So it does. There are a lot of smaller organizations or different types of industries that do pay minimum wage or just above. And so effective January 1st, 2025, there will be a minimum wage increase from $10.33 to $10.56 an hour. However, that's only going to be effective until February 20th. With ESTA, there is a secondary increase to minimum wage that will be effective February 21st, which brings the minimum wage up to $12.48. The minimum tipped wage also increases January 1st from $3.93 to $4.01 per hour, with an additional increase as of February 21st. And so on screen there is the far right there where it's got the 85%. That is specific to minors under the age of 18. Employers can pay minors under the age of 18 at 85% of the minimum wage. So right now this is the current minimum wage set through 2028. October 2028, the state treasury will, based on the inflation at that time, calculate the next minimum wage increase and have that posted by November 1st, 2028 to be effective the following February.
That's a lot.
It is a lot.
And an employer, I can see a small employer of 1 or 2 people saying, you know what, I'm just gonna, here's $100 bill. And just let's keep it, let's call it square. But that's the fear, that there's going to be people that are not in compliance, and it's through their fear of just more paperwork, more regulation. What are you recommending that employers do? You, as a company, you provide all those services and answers, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely work with a HR consulting firm or an employment attorney. Again, it's looking at policies and really preparing for the worst case scenario of the laws going through as they are today. And some of these small companies, especially like the restaurant industry, with earned tip credit changing, it's going to have a large financial impact on some of these family-owned smaller businesses over several years. We're seeing people get pretty creative though with some solutions that they're attempting to come up with. Not all of them are compliant so far, right? So we're like, okay, let's keep talking, but we like their thinking and how they're really trying to think outside the box of how can I be compliant, but also not pass on so much cost to the patrons that now will be coming in with these larger increases.
Yeah, I have friends that are in the restaurant industry, and they're really nervous.
Yeah.
And it's going to impact all of us as patrons.
Yeah.
So you'll be happy to help people, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Should they just go to your website and hit the HR Solutions section?
So yes, we do have our
here.
contact information
Even
on
better.
screen.
There we go.
So we encourage everybody to reach out to us, to Katie or myself, but you can also reach out to our team through the HR Solutions page on Rehmann's website.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate all the information. Still, you know, it's a moving target.
It is.
Well, good luck with that, and thanks for taking care of employers, and thanks for being with us today.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you for having
Appreciate
us.
You bet. From Rehmann HR Solutions Senior Manager Consultant Katie Stewart and Senior HR Professional Kara Skotsky.